Atlas was told to stay 10 feet away, but loyalty has never understood distance the way people do. The Saturday drill at Camp Pendleton had been designed to look simple from the outside. A clean training range, dry California dirt, white boundary ropes, orange markers, a shade canopy near the equipment station, Marines moving in calm formation beneath a pale morning sun. Everything had a place, and everyone had a role. Caleb Rose stood in the second line wearing practical training gear, his white-skinned face quiet beneath the brim of his cap, his posture straight, his hands still. 10 feet to his left, Atlas sat exactly where Commander Hayes had ordered him to sit. The German Shepherd looked smaller than the other K9s on the range, but there was nothing small about the focus in his amber eyes. His sable brown and black coat lifted gently in the ocean breeze coming from miles away, and his ears kept shifting, catching every whistle, every boot step, every breath that did not belong to the rhythm of the drill. Commander Hayes watched from near the rail with a clipboard under one arm and a whistle resting against his chest. He was not a cruel man. That almost made his judgment heavier. He believed in distance, discipline, clean response. A K9 that stayed too close to one Marine, in his mind, could miss the wider mission. Caleb had heard the warning all week. Too attached, too dependent, too tuned to Euro. So now Atlas sat apart, proving he could obey. The drill began smoothly. A whistle cut the air. Marines stepped forward. K9s matched movement with practice control. The sun warmed the dust until it smelled faintly of grass, rubber mats, and dry earth. Caleb did not look at Atlas, though every part of him wanted to. He kept his eyes forward, jaw set, breathing even. Trust the dog. Trust the distance. Trust what they had built without making it look like need. For the first minute, Atlas did everything right. He stayed. He watched. He did not creep toward Caleb. He did not whine. He did not break formation. Hayes made a mark on the clipboard. Then something changed. It was not loud. It was not visible to most of the field. A young Marine near the shade canopy, Daniel Price, shifted his weight and gave a quick smile to another recruit as if everything was fine. But Atlas's ears snapped forward. His nose lifted. His body went still in a different way, no longer obedient stillness, but alert stillness. Caleb felt it before he saw it. The air around the dog had tightened. Another command sounded. The formation moved on. Atlas did not. Caleb turned his eyes just enough to see him. The little German Shepherd was staring at Daniel, not confused, not distracted, but certain. Hayes raised his whistle slightly. The test was here. Atlas had been told to stay. He had been trained all week to hold distance, to wait, to prove his loyalty could be contained inside a rule. Daniel raised one hand to signal readiness, but his fingers trembled for half a second in the sun. Atlas stood. Caleb did not call him back. The whole range seemed to pause between one heartbeat and the next. Then Atlas ran. 7 days earlier, Commander Hayes had watched Atlas follow Caleb Rowe across the K9 field as if the little German Shepherd had been stitched to the Marine's shadow. It was late afternoon then, the kind of Camp Pendleton light that turned the dust copper and made every fence line glow. The day's drills were finished. Handlers were gathering leads, recruits were stacking training cones, and the larger dogs were cooling down near the water station. Caleb stood alone by the rail, one hand resting on the top board, his white-skinned face unreadable beneath a calm that looked stronger than it felt. Atlas lay beside his left boot, close enough that his shoulder touched the leather. Every time Caleb shifted, Atlas shifted. Every time Caleb looked toward the far end of the field, Atlas looked there too. To some of the younger Marines, it seemed sweet. To Hayes, it looked like a problem forming quietly in plain sight. "Row," Hayes called. Caleb turned at once. Atlas rose with him. Hayes noticed that first. The dog did not wait for a command. He simply rose because Caleb had moved. Hayes crossed the field with his clipboard tucked under one arm, boots making slow prints in the dry ground. He was a broad-shouldered commander with gray at his temples, a steady voice, and the kind of discipline that never needed to announce itself loudly. He stopped a few feet away and looked from Caleb to Atlas. Does he ever stay behind? Caleb's hand lowered slightly, not to restrain Atlas, only to feel where the dog was. "When I tell him to." Hayes studied the German Shepherd. Atlas sat straight, ears lifted, amber eyes moving between the two men. He did not look nervous. He looked interested. That, somehow, made Hayes more concerned. "He watches you more than he watches the field." Caleb did not answer. A gull cried somewhere beyond the range, carried inland by the ocean wind. Hayes continued, quieter now. A working K-9 has to serve the whole unit, not just one man. The words were not harsh, but they found the exact place inside Caleb that had been trying not to need anyone. He looked down at Atlas. The little shepherd's sable coat was dusty from the drills, one ear tipped slightly backward toward a distant crate being moved behind them. Even while focused on Caleb, Atlas was listening to everything. Caleb saw it. Hayes did not. He is not ignoring the field, sir, Caleb said. He is reading it through me. Hayes's expression did not change. That is what worries me. The silence after that was thin and sharp. Around them, the base kept moving. Metal latches clicked. Water bowls scraped concrete. A handler laughed softly at something near the kennels. Ordinary sounds, safe sounds. But Caleb felt Atlas lean against his boot, not with fear, not with weakness, but with the steady pressure of a promise. Hayes lowered the clipboard. For the next week, he trains at distance. 10 feet minimum during formation work. Longer holds. No shadowing after drills. If he cannot operate without being tied to your every movement, I will reassign him to another handler. Caleb's jaw tightened once. Only once. He had been given orders before that felt heavier than their words. This one landed quietly, but it landed deep. Atlas looked up at him, tail still, as if waiting to see whether the world had changed. Caleb gave the smallest nod. Understood. Hayes held his gaze for a moment, then walked away toward the command office, leaving behind the smell of dust and cooling rubber mats. Caleb stayed by the rail. The field was nearly empty now. Atlas remained at his side, exactly where he had always chosen to be. Caleb crouched slowly and touched 2 fingers to the dog's collar. Looks like we have to prove them wrong, he whispered. Atlas pressed his nose to Caleb's sleeve, gentle and certain, as if proving anything had never been the point. Lovingwell had been. Caleb Rowe returned to his room that evening with Atlas walking behind him instead of beside him, because that was the first new rule, and both of them seemed to feel the awkwardness of it in the quiet space between footsteps. The room was small, square, and orderly, tucked near the edge of the K-9 compound where the sounds of the base arrived softened by distance. Caleb hung the lead on its hook, set his cap on the desk, and rinsed Atlas's water bowl beneath the sink until the metal shone. Everything had a place in that room. Boots beneath the chair, training gloves folded beside the notebook, coffee tin in the upper cabinet, Atlas's blanket at the foot of the bed, folded once each morning and opened each night. Caleb had built his life that way because order did not ask questions. It did not wonder why he preferred dawn runs alone, or why he ate dinner standing at the counter, or why he sometimes stopped speaking halfway through a sentence because the words felt too heavy to carry across the room. Before Atlas, silence had felt like discipline. After Atlas, it had started to feel like companionship. That was the dangerous part. Caleb stood by the desk and looked at the blanket. Usually Atlas would circle twice, settle near the bed, and let out a long breath that made the whole room loosen around the edges. Tonight, Caleb pointed to the doorway instead. Place, he said, voice low but steady. Atlas paused. His ears lifted. The German shepherd knew the command. He obeyed it. He walked to the open doorway, lowered himself just outside the room, and rested his chin on his paws. 10 feet, maybe 12. Exactly the kind of distance Hayes wanted. Caleb sat on the edge of the bed and told himself this was training. Good training. Necessary training. A K-9 had to operate apart from his handler. A Marine had to make hard choices without turning them into feelings. But the space between them seemed louder than any bark. Atlas did not whine. He did not scratch the floor or creep back in. He simply watched Caleb with those amber eyes, patient and puzzled, as if trying to understand why love had suddenly been given a boundary line. Caleb removed one boot, then the other, placing them neatly beneath the chair. Atlas's gaze followed the movement. Not needy. Alert. Caleb noticed that even from the doorway, the dog still tracked everything. The change in Caleb's breathing, the slight stiffness in his right shoulder, the way his hand lingered near the old dog tag on the desk. Atlas had never needed to be close to be aware. Close was only how he comforted what he noticed. Later, when the lights were low and the base outside had settled into its nighttime hum, Caleb lay awake longer than he wanted to admit. The room was quiet in the way he used to prefer, but without Atlas beside the bed, the quiet no longer felt clean. It felt empty. At the doorway, Atlas shifted once, then stilled again, holding the command like a promise he did not fully understand. Caleb turned his head and found the dog's outline in the dim light. Small for a German shepherd, yes. Too attached, maybe by some chart on a clipboard. But as Caleb watched him guard the threshold from 10 feet away, he wondered whether Hayes had named the wrong problem. Maybe Atlas was not afraid of distance. Maybe Caleb was afraid that if loyalty was tested too hard, one day it would learn to stay away. The next morning, Caleb learned that distance could be measured in feet, but trust could not. He brought Atlas to the training field before most of the handlers arrived, while the sun was still low behind the barracks and the dirt held the coolness of night. 10 feet. That was where Caleb placed him. Not beside his boot. Not in his shadow. 10 feet away near a white boundary rope, facing the obstacle lane with the kind of careful stillness that made the little German shepherd look older than he was. Caleb stepped back and gave the command. Stay. Atlas stayed. His sable coat moved lightly in the breeze. His amber eyes stayed on Caleb for 1 second, then shifted across the field, tracking a maintenance crew by the storage shed, a rolling cart near the water station, a loose strap hanging from a stack of training mats. He was doing exactly what Caleb had tried to explain to Hayes. He was watching everything. But watching everything from far away carried a different ache. Caleb walked 20 feet out, then 30. Atlas did not move. Caleb turned his back. Atlas did not move. A handler named Mason came through the gate carrying 2 paper cups of coffee and stopped when he saw the distance between them. Commander's orders? He asked. Caleb nodded without looking away from Atlas. Mason handed him 1 cup and followed his gaze. He looks like he hates it. Caleb took the coffee. He is obeying it. That is not the same thing. The words sat between them longer than expected. Across the field, a metal bucket slipped from a bench near the equipment area and landed with a dull, harmless clang. Atlas's head snapped toward it. His body leaned forward, ready to check, ready to report, ready to do the thing he had always done when something changed in Caleb's world. Then he stopped himself. He looked back at Caleb. Stayed. Caleb felt the small victory turn cold in his chest. That was what the week was teaching Atlas. Not just distance. Hesitation. Not just discipline. Doubt. Caleb set the coffee down on the rail and crossed the field slowly. Atlas held the command until Caleb stood directly in front of him. Only then did the dog's tail move once, low and uncertain. Caleb crouched and touched 2 fingers to Atlas's collar. Good stay, he said. The words were correct. They tasted wrong. More handlers arrived as the morning warmed. The range filled with commands, whistles, boot steps, and the smell of dust rising under the sun. Atlas worked cleanly through the new distance drills. He waited when Caleb walked away. He returned only when called. He no longer pressed against Caleb's boot after every task. On paper, he was improving. On the field, something essential seemed to dim. Hayes watched from the far side, making notes with the satisfaction of a man seeing a standard take shape. Caleb understood the standard. He respected it. But each time Atlas checked himself before responding to a small sound, Caleb wondered whether they were sanding away the very edge that made the dog remarkable. By late afternoon, the heat softened and the shadows stretched long across the white boundary ropes. Caleb placed Atlas at the edge of the course for one last hold. He walked away, stopped at 30 feet, then 40. Atlas stayed. Perfectly. Quietly. Too perfectly. Then, from behind the shade canopy, a young Marine named Daniel Price laughed with another recruit while stacking signal boards for the weekend drill. It was an ordinary laugh, light and quick, but Atlas turned toward it with sudden focus. His ears lifted. His nose tested the air. Caleb saw it. A flicker. A question. Something in Daniel's rhythm had caught the dog's attention before it caught anyone else's. Caleb almost released him. Almost. But Hayes was watching. So Caleb held the command, and Atlas held himself still, the loyalty in him waiting behind an invisible line. By the 5th day, Caleb understood that Atlas was not struggling with distance. He was struggling with permission. The little German shepherd could sit 30 feet away and hold a command longer than most dogs on the range. He could watch Caleb walk behind the storage shed, disappear for 10 seconds, and still remain planted beside the white rope with his ears high and his body steady. He could ignore tennis balls, food scents, barking dogs, and the rolling carts that rattled past the kennels in the morning. On paper, Atlas was becoming exactly what Commander Hayes wanted. In Caleb's chest, that felt less like progress and more like a warning. They trained at sunset because the field was quieter then, and because Caleb could think better when the hard California light softened into gold. He placed Atlas at one end of the training lane and walked to the other, 40 feet away, then 50. The distance looked larger in the low light. A leash length was one thing. Half a field was another. Atlas sat perfectly, sable coat glowing warm along the edges, amber eyes fixed not only on Caleb, but on everything surrounding him. Caleb lifted one hand. Stay. Atlas stayed. Caleb turned his back. Atlas stayed. Caleb took 3 slow steps toward the equipment area. Atlas stayed. Then a gust of wind moved through the shade canopy, lifting the edge of a signal board and knocking it lightly against its frame. Tap, tap, tap. A harmless sound, but Atlas's ears snapped toward it. His nose rose. His body leaned forward 1 inch before he stopped himself. Caleb saw the conflict pass through the dog like a shadow. Instinct said check it. Training said stay. Atlas chose stay. A week earlier, Caleb would have called that obedience and been proud. Now it made his mouth go dry. He walked back across the field and crouched in front of Atlas. The dog did not move until released. When Caleb finally gave the word, Atlas stepped forward and pressed his head gently into Caleb's chest, not frantic, not needy, just relieved to be allowed near the person he had been tracking from afar. Caleb closed one hand around the collar and looked across the training range. The white ropes, the cones, the markers, the clean lanes. So many lines drawn by people trying to make the world safer by making it simpler. But the world was not simple. The right thing did not always stay inside the boundary. Later, Mason joined them near the rail, holding a clipboard he had borrowed for inventory. He nodded toward Atlas, who was lying 10 feet away because Caleb had not yet released him to come closer. He is getting better at it, Mason said. Caleb looked at the dog. That is what worries me. Mason frowned. Obedience worries you. Caleb watched Atlas glance toward Daniel Price near the shade canopy again. Daniel was stacking signal boards with the same easy smile, but he paused twice to wipe his forehead, even though the evening air was cooling. Atlas noticed. Caleb noticed Atlas noticing. Not obedience, Caleb said. The wrong kind of obedience. Mason followed his gaze, then looked back at Atlas. The little shepherd's tail was still. His ears were trained toward Daniel, but his paws remained fixed. Waiting. Always waiting now. Caleb stood and gave a soft release. Atlas came to him at once, then surprised both Marines by passing Caleb and walking 3 steps toward Daniel before stopping and looking back for permission. Caleb felt something settle in him, quiet and heavy. Atlas had not forgotten his instinct. He had only learned to ask whether he was allowed to use it. Caleb looked toward the emptying field, then down at the dog who had been loyal enough to obey even when obedience cost him his voice. Tomorrow, Caleb whispered, resting his hand on Atlas's head. If you know something I do not, I will listen first. Atlas looked up at him, amber eyes catching the last light. The distance between them remained 10 feet on paper, but something in Caleb had stepped closer. The weekend drill began beneath a bright California morning, the kind of light that made every line on the training range look sharper than it felt. White ropes marked the movement lanes. Orange cones stood in clean rows. Signal boards waited near the shade canopy. A water station sat 30 yards from the equipment area, its metal coolers sweating in the sun. Marines moved with practiced calm, checking radios, adjusting gloves, and stepping into formation while the K-9 teams waited along the rail. Commander Hayes stood near the center with his whistle and clipboard, watching the field the way a man watches a question he has already decided how to answer. Caleb Rowe stood in the second line, shoulders square, face quiet, hands relaxed at his sides. 10 feet away, Atlas sat exactly where he had been placed. The little German shepherd's sable coat shone along the edges, and his amber eyes moved constantly, not restless, not nervous, only awake to the world. Hayes had built the drill to test separation. Caleb knew it. Atlas would have to work at a fixed distance, respond to general signals, hold position through movement, and ignore anything outside the assigned formation unless released. It was fair. It was controlled. It was also incomplete. Daniel Price stood near the shade canopy, assigned to manage the signal boards and timing markers. He was young, steady, and eager, The kind of Marine who smiled even when tired because he did not want anyone to think he needed a break. Caleb noticed him only because Atlas did. Before the first whistle, Atlas's ears angled toward Daniel. The dog's nose lifted once, then lowered. Caleb remembered the evening before, the way Atlas had tried to step toward Daniel and stopped to ask permission. "Easy," Caleb said softly, not as a correction, but as a promise. The drill started. Boots moved over dirt in measured rhythm. K9s held their lanes. Commands traveled down the line, clear and clipped. Atlas performed perfectly. He stayed at distance. He shifted when signaled. He paused when ordered. He did not drift toward Caleb, though Caleb could feel the dog checking on him in small flashes, a glance, an ear turn, a breath timed to movement. Hayes made notes. For the first few minutes, everything looked like proof that the commander had been right. Distance could be taught. Attachment could be managed. A bond could be shaped into something clean enough for a clipboard. Then Daniel reached up to adjust a signal board, and his hand paused in the air half a second too long. He lowered it quickly, still smiling, still standing straight. Most of the field missed it. Atlas did not. His head turned. His ears locked. A faint breeze moved across the range, carrying the scent of warm dust, rubber mats, sunscreen, and something sharper beneath it, the salt of a body working too hard under the sun. Caleb saw Atlas's shoulders tighten. The next whistle sounded, calling the K9s into the final movement lane. Atlas rose on command, took 2 steps, then stopped. Caleb's heart sank and steadied at the same time. Hayes looked up from the clipboard. "Row," he called, warning in his voice. Caleb did not answer. He watched Atlas. Daniel laughed at something Mason said near the canopy, but the sound was thin now, almost weightless. Atlas looked back at Caleb once, not asking to disobey, asking to be trusted. Caleb let the leash remain loose. The drill moved forward without them for 1 breath, then 2. Atlas stood between command and conscience, small against the wide range, every lesson of the week pressing down on him. Then Caleb gave the quietest permission he had ever given. "Notice." Atlas turned toward Daniel. Atlas moved before the field understood why. He did not sprint wildly or pull in panic. He ran with a clean, certain purpose, small paws striking the dry ground in a straight line toward the shade canopy where Daniel Price stood beside the signal boards. For 1 breath, no one reacted. The drill had been moving smoothly, the formation still stepping forward, the other K9s holding their lanes. Then Commander Hayes lifted his whistle, and the sharp glint of it caught the sun. "Row," he called louder this time. Caleb heard him. So did Atlas. Neither stopped. Caleb followed at a steady pace, not chasing, not correcting, only staying close enough to support the choice he had already made. The leash remained loose in his hand. That loose line told the whole story. Daniel looked over as Atlas approached and gave a quick, confused smile. "I am good, buddy," he said, trying to sound light. Atlas did not jump. He did not bark over and over. He stopped directly in front of Daniel, sat squarely in the dust, and lifted 1 paw onto the toe of Daniel's boot. It was not a trick. It was a signal. 1 short bark followed, low and clear. The kind of sound that did not ask for attention, it required it. The field went still. Mason, standing near the canopy with a stack of timing cards, lowered them slowly. Daniel tried to laugh again, but the laugh faded before it became a full sound. His smile slipped at the edges. He blinked hard against the sunlight and placed 1 hand on the table beside him. "Price," Mason said. Daniel nodded too quickly. "I am fine." Atlas pressed his palm more firmly on the boot and looked back at Caleb. There it was, the look Caleb had learned to trust during long evenings on the empty field. Not fear, not confusion, certainty carrying concern. Caleb stepped beside Daniel, his voice calm enough to keep the moment from becoming larger than the man. "Take a knee, Price." Daniel hesitated. Marines were good at pushing through. Too good sometimes. Caleb knew that kind of pride. He had worn it like armor. Atlas knew it too, maybe not by name, but by scent, by breath, by the small tremor in a hand that tried to look steady. "Just for a second," Caleb added. Daniel lowered himself carefully onto the bench beneath the canopy. Atlas stayed in front of him, sitting close but not crowding, ears forward, eyes bright. Hayes arrived a few steps behind, whistle still in his hand, expression hard to read. For a moment, Caleb thought the commander would call it a failure, a broken command, exactly what he had feared all week. Instead, Hayes looked at Daniel's pale face, then at the slight shake in his fingers as he reached for the water cooler. The clipboard lowered by an inch. "Medic," Hayes said, voice controlled but immediate. No panic moved through the range. Only trained urgency. Mason grabbed a fresh bottle of water. Another Marine jogged toward the medical station. Daniel kept insisting he was all right, softer each time, while Atlas remained planted near his boot like a small, silent witness. Caleb crouched beside the German shepherd and rested one hand along his back. The dog's breathing was steady. Caleb's was not. He looked at the white boundary rope Atlas had crossed, then at Daniel sitting in the shade, then at Hayes watching with the whistle and used in his hand. All week they had asked Atlas to prove he could stay away, but the moment that mattered had asked something different. It had asked whether loyalty knew when to step forward. The medic arrived in less than a minute, but the truth had already reached everyone before he did. Daniel Price sat beneath the shade canopy with both hands wrapped around a water bottle, his shoulders lowered now that he no longer had to pretend he was fine. The medical check was calm, quick, and professional. No sirens. No panic. No dramatic rush across the field. Just trained people doing what trained people do when someone needs help early enough for help to be simple. Daniel had pushed too hard through the morning heat, skipped most of his water, and ignored the early signs because the drill mattered to him. That was the kind of mistake good Marines could make. Not because they were careless, but because they cared too much about not slowing anyone down. Atlas had caught it before pride turned it into something worse. The little German shepherd sat beside the bench, sable coat dusted at the paws, amber eyes fixed on Daniel with quiet attention. Every few seconds, Daniel looked down at him as if trying to understand how a dog had seen what he had hidden from men standing 3 feet away. "I really thought I was covering it," Daniel said softly. Caleb Rose stood nearby, one hand resting on Atlas's lead, which still hung loose. "You were," Caleb answered. "For people." Mason gave a short breath of a laugh, gentle and relieved. Daniel managed a tired smile and reached down. Atlas leaned forward just enough to let the young Marine touch the top of his head, then sat back into position like the job was not finished until Daniel's breathing settled. Commander Hayes watched from the edge of the canopy. His whistle remained in his hand, and used. That detail mattered more than anyone said. A week earlier, he would have blown it the second Atlas crossed the line. He would have called it attachment, broken formation, failure to hold distance. Now the white boundary rope lay behind Atlas in the dust, and somehow it looked smaller than it had all morning. Hayes looked toward the drill lane, where the markers still waited in perfect order. The course had tested distance. Atlas had answered with awareness. The course had measured obedience. Atlas had shown judgment. The medic stood and gave Daniel instructions to rest, hydrate, and step out of the next rotation. Daniel nodded, embarrassed but grateful, and this time he did not argue. Caleb saw Hayes notice that too. The commander's face did not soften all at once. Men like Hayes did not change in public with grand gestures. They changed by becoming quiet in the places where they used to be certain. He stepped closer to Atlas and looked down at him. Atlas looked back without wagging, without shrinking, without asking to be forgiven for doing the right thing. "He alerted before you released him," Hayes said. Caleb kept his voice steady. "Yes, sir." "And you let him go?" "Yes, sir." Hayes glanced toward Daniel, then back to the dog. For a moment, the whole field seemed to wait inside that answer. Caleb did not defend himself. He did not explain the week of distance drills, the doorway, the silent room, the way Atlas had learned to ask permission before trusting his own gift. He only stood there with the leash loose, because some things are clearer when they are not argued. Hayes finally lowered the whistle into his pocket. "Resume the drill in 10 minutes, he called to the unit. Then, quieter, meant only for Caleb. Keep him close enough to notice. Caleb looked down at Atlas. The little shepherd's ears lifted at the sound of his name spoken nowhere, at a meaning carried without command. Caleb crouched and brushed dust from the dog's collar. "You heard him," he whispered. Atlas touched his nose to Caleb's sleeve, then turned his head back toward Daniel, still watching until the young Marine was safely walking toward the medical station. Only then did Atlas move beside Caleb's boot, not because he had been ordered there, but because his work was done. The next morning arrived quietly, without whistles, without dust, without anyone trying to prove a point. The K9 field at Camp Pendleton looked softer in the early light, its white boundary ropes glowing faintly, its orange cones lined up like small markers of yesterday's certainty. Caleb Rowe stood near the rail with Atlas at his left boot, close enough that the German shepherd's shoulder brushed the leather. No one told him to move back. No one measured the distance. The air smelled of cool dirt, clean water, and the faint salt carried inland from the Pacific. Daniel Price walked past the medical station slowly, cleared for light duty, holding a bottle of water like a lesson he intended to remember. When he saw Atlas, he stopped, smiled with a little embarrassment, and tapped 2 fingers to his own chest in thanks. Atlas tilted his head, then gave one soft wag, as if gratitude was accepted but the matter did not need ceremony. Commander Hayes came across the field a few minutes later. He did not bring the clipboard. He did not carry the whistle where everyone could see it. That alone changed the morning. Caleb straightened out of habit, but Hayes lifted one hand, not as an order, only as a quiet request to stay as he was. For a moment, the 3 of them stood in the wide hush of the empty range. The commander, the Marine, and the small K9 whose loyalty had crossed a line no rule could fully explain. Hayes looked at Atlas first. The dog sat calmly, sable coat catching the first gold of sunrise, amber eyes clear and awake. Then Hayes looked at Caleb. "I called it attachment," he said. His voice was low, steady, stripped of pride. "I was wrong. It was awareness." Caleb did not answer right away. Some words deserved room after they were spoken. Atlas leaned lightly into his boot, not hiding there, not clinging, just present. Caleb lowered his hand and let the lead fall even looser through his fingers. "He always knew the difference," Caleb said. Hayes gave a small nod. "Then our job is to make sure we do too." The commander stepped back and glanced toward the field where yesterday's drill had paused and changed shape. "Keep him with you, Rowe." It was not a favor. It was a decision. Caleb felt it settle into him, warm and almost painful. He crouched beside Atlas and adjusted the collar, though it did not need adjusting. The small act gave his hand somewhere to place the feeling. Atlas looked up, ears high, eyes patient, as if he had never doubted the ending, only waited for the people to catch up. Across the range, Mason opened the gate for the morning handlers. Dogs began to enter, strong and eager, tails moving, paws stirring the dust. Atlas stood, but this time he did not press forward, and he did not need to be held back. He took one step beside Caleb, then paused, choosing the space between closeness and readiness all on his own. Caleb smiled faintly. The distance between them had stopped being a test. It had become trust. Together they walked onto the field, Marine and K9, not bound by weakness, not corrected out of loyalty, but steadied by it. Some bonds are not problems to solve. They are warnings, promises, and quiet forms of grace.